Now I have the honor of introducing Dr. Yashoda Thakore. She is like, I've not known her for a long time, but as long as I've known her, I feel like I've known her forever. And she is an exponent of Kuchipudi and Devadasi Nrityam. It's a repertoire of hereditary women dancers. She reinforces her repertoire with her understanding and practice of yoga. She was awarded a doctoral degree for her research on the interrelationship between yoga and the Indian classical dance. Yashoda works relentlessly with the hereditary women dancers on the social, historical, aesthetic aspects of Devadasi repertoire. Yashoda is now chair, Department of Kuchipudi at University of Silicon Andhra, California, where she teaches dance history, theory, and a practice in for graduate students. She was conferred the Bangalore Raganatnama Award in 2017 by the Samskriti organization Guntur and the Ugadi Puraskaram by the government of Andhra Pradesh. And I welcome her, and it's going to be a very interesting talk. Just stay tuned.
Namaskaram. I'm grateful to the organizers of Bharatvarsh, the cradle of civilization, for inviting me over to present my talk, Unrecognized Women's Labor, the Role of the Devadasi. I'm also grateful to the numerous hereditary singer-dancer women, the Devadasis, who kept the art and themselves alive through the most trying situations. So my position and my talk today may seem a little different from the very esoteric and profound talks I've been listening to since this morning, because it's more about the present, the woman of today. I divide this talk into 3 sections. The first refers to a short story called Kalupu Mokkalu, written by Sripada Subramanya Shastri in Telugu. I put forth my story as one from the Devadasi lineage, using performance to trace her changing status in society in the second section. The third section touches upon a few communities which depended on the Devadasi and disappeared with her. I complicate the disappearance of the Devadasi and interrogate the implications of the same. Kalupu Mokkalu, meaning weeds, was written by the celebrated Brahmin writer in Telugu, Sripada Subramanya Shastri. The intention of discussing the story is to bring to the fore the complexity of Indian society, which is enriched by indigenous languages, traditions, and lifestyles. Located in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the story revolves around a poor, learned, conservative Brahmin priest who did not want his son to take up the priesthood, but to be educated and work as a government servant. He approaches the corrupt, yet perceptive clerk from the backward classes and bribes him with all his savings for a job for his son. The clerk tells him that the president, yet another Brahmin, desires the Bhogam Kalavantalu woman, the artist woman, Dugirala Seshachalam. The president would do anything for Seshachalam if she spent a night with him, he says. The priest is embarrassed, but decides to go to her. She invites him in respectfully to be seated and offers dakshina as per norms. She is ruffled and indignant in all dignity when he expresses his expectations from her. Seshachalam reveals to the Brahmin about an encounter with the president she had had earlier. When he happened to see her in a performance she was commissioned for. She tells him that she did not comply with the president's advances, which he avenged by dismissing her from the stage after she had worn her ankle bells and by giving her place to a younger artist on stage. This is the height of insult for a dancer, for an artist. Nevertheless, Seshachalam agrees to comply with the president's condition now, saying that this was a price she is willing to pay to ensure a steady income for the priest's family. She questions the priest about the preset notions of society, about the behavior of people from particular castes, and even about her belonging to any caste at all. And the story goes on. It so happens, just to satisfy curiosity, that the son does get a job, but for just half the contract, half the period of the contract, and half the amount that was agreed upon. So the priest and the clerk, the priest was not really benefited by this, in full at least. This conversation between the erudite Seshachalam and the priest has been an area of study, critique, and admiration in the world of Telugu literature. Translation does not do justice to the spirit of the dialogue. This may be abrupt, but I will move to the second section of the talk, where I attempt a linear narration of the complex, layered history of the Devadasi, literally the servant of God. This is the Devadasi from South India. She was called variously in indigenous languages, and Kalavantulu was what she was called in Telugu areas after the words Bhogam and Sanivaru fell out of repute. I must admit, this simplistic account would do no justice to the discourse of the Devadasi. She was the dancing girl, both at the court and the temple, parallelly, at the same time. So this general rhetoric we hear that she was originally at the temple and then at the court and then she fell out of repute is not true. It was at the same time at the temple and the court. The Devadasi remained unmarried and supported herself by dancing and singing. Nevertheless, she was allowed to have a human partner. Her role seems apparent from the 9th century AD in the Agama Shastras in South India. The Hindu king was her patron at this stage when she enjoyed the produce of the lands, the manyams that were given by the temple. So she didn't own the land. The system was such that the Devadasi at the temple did not own the land, but she enjoyed the produce of the land as long as she was giving her services to the temple. When it was time for her to hand over, to retire, it was her responsibility to prepare another dancer in her place. So she would train. It could have been her biological daughter or somebody adopted, somebody who chose to learn it from her, but she had to install another one in her place, and then that dancer takes care of the whole family with the produce of the land. This also ensured economy for the family and the service to the temple. At the temple, a little bit about the temple, what she really did, just a little bit, not in full. The Baliharana is a ritual performed by the priest and the temple woman. During this, they invite the deities of the 8 directions, the Ashtadikpalakas, give them their rightful places to be seated, the asana, and then offer food, bali, to be entertained by the Devadasi's art briefly. All this is to implore them to alert and make sure no negative force enters the temple. So here the Devadasi and the priest are not at the temple to ask for something for themselves, but to ask for the good of the temple, of the society itself. So we are really talking about the labor of both the priest and the Devadasi here. However, there is absolutely no description of the dance or music offered, and I cannot claim knowledge of the content in this context. Besides this ritual, the Devadasi also sang and danced to songs of Amar in the indigenous language. Sringara, or Amar, was always central to the Devadasi's existence. Her existence, which was not different from her art. The art and the artist cannot be looked at as two distinct entities from each other, in her case. She was a part of all the activities at the temple by choice. I present a lalipata, a lullaby to Rama that I have learned. I choose to dance because the Devadasi cannot be spoken about outside her dance. She is not even interested. My teachers from the villages to whom I go and learn are not even interested in the socio-political history and the rhetoric. They say, లేచి చెయ్యి, సరేలే తర్వాత మాట్లాడదాం, we'll talk about this later, you first dance. You know, everything about their life is just dancing. When she danced at the temple, outside the ritual, it was not very different from what she danced for the king. Her artistry was celebrated as she embodied Amar through her repertoire, through the aesthetic exposition of Abhinaya. Sringara was not taboo. Yet, there was no necessity to educate society in closed rooms. One of the expectations from the Devadasi was to create this awareness and an aesthetic experience through her presence and performance. I choose to perform another piece for you. This is the Salam Darbu, which is the performance at the court, really. This is a Darbu that is performed across South India, the Tamil Nadu and Andhra, because it was one big Madras presidency. And the first two parts talk about the king, the Maratha king. The last one talks about the Nayaka king, who was before the Maratha king. But now I'm only doing one small charanam for you, because we do need to bring the king in. This is the Hindu king, and when the Hindu kings were her patrons, the position of the Devadasi was quite something else, where she was really respected. By the 19th century, during part of the colonial period, the zamindars were among her patrons. By now, the practice of dedicating girls to temples began to dwindle, owing to the vehement protests from the elite class. It was interesting that the English-educated elites of our own country, the Indian nationalists, were more determined to abolish the Devadasi system and erase the women from the English colonizers. These efforts from within the Indian patriarchal society began as early as 1890 and gradually built momentum. Meanwhile, our Devadasi kept adapting to the changing society around her. Her repertoire now included the Javali. But before I perform or talk about the Javali, I must do 1 minute of the Padam, which these Kalavantulu women, the Devadasis, were famous for. Just the Pallavi, where in this song she says, in the coastal Andhra area where I come from, they sit and do this. So she says, oh, he sent a message, is it? Tell him I'm not coming. So it is a Khandita Nayaka, where she just says, no, I'm not coming. But since I'm only taking the Pallavi, I'll just use my imagination, which I'm supposed to, and tell you in how many ways she remembers what he has given to her. And she says, I will still not come. You go tell him and return whatever he has given. Her repertoire now included the Javali, still replete with Amar, but written in more colloquial Telugu, and music with a slight Western touch. So we must remember that by now, even in the south, when the Marathas came down south from Maharashtra, by then they came with Mughal influence and they came with colonial influence. So in Tanjavur, the court was eclectic, the court was beautiful with Urdu, Hindi, Tamil, Telugu, English, all Gujarati also. But they came, it was beautiful because of all these influences, and they found that they had to tweak it a little bit for the audience, the changing audience. And as she did this, while I performed these, ladies and gentlemen, I'm performing this for you to see how her position, her status in society also changes. So I'm using the repertoire itself as a visual for you to understand this. So she now performed Abhinaya while she stood, probably sensing the depleting sensitivity of the audience. Dugirala Seshachalam, the lady in our story, the dancer from our story, is placed in this period. Let me perform Javali for you, where now the Naika, the heroine, says, "Oh, my friend, he must be so hurt. His heart must have," first she sends him away. She says she's not coming. And I just chose the song that way so that there is a continuity for you. Stop. Yes. Yeah? Okay. That was not completely edited. I thought I'll do this whole thing for you, but then it's quite late. So these performances were often referred to in Telugu as Mezuvani. So here we must talk about a little bit about the Persian influence in the dances of the Devadasi. If you have seen the Salam Darbu, there was a salam. In a few other songs, you will find wazir as a word. And here you have the Mezuvani, which comes from the Urdu word mez, meaning table, or more appropriately, dinner table, indicating that this dance was performed at private gatherings of the elite. The colonizers and the now colonized minds of the westernized elite Indian men could not comprehend an unmarried woman having a place in society and even being respected. The Devadasi was viewed variously. Society saw her as the supernatural woman akin to the goddess, the ultra chaste woman married to the god. That should remind you of the nuns, which we were not nuns by any standards. The singer dancer by profession, a victim of colonialism, the degenerate one whose sexuality became her tool to break families, and even as a witch. So this was the time when in Europe, an unmarried woman or a single woman was treated as a witch, and they had practices to ward her off and keep her away. So that was the same thing that was brought into our country, and we believed it. Our men believed that unmarried women were witches. So essentially, her ambiguous marital status was difficult for society to handle. Sadly, Catholic Victorian morality was here to stay. At this stage, reform movements took it upon themselves to cleanse society by making these women disappear. Movements like the Anti-Notch movement and the Madras Devadasi Prevention of Dedication Act in 1947 did cause the dancing Devadasi to disappear. The women, now shamed and stripped of their income and agency, had nowhere to go because they were equated to prostitutes. And this act that came in, the Madras Devadasi Act, very clearly names them as prostitutes, and they say if they dance, they're equated to prostitutes. So, interestingly, this act was not applied to prostitutes themselves. That's a profession by itself. So, one thing is, there is no point in conflating two professions. Second point was, that was a law not meant for dancers. That was applied and passed for singer dancers. She had no identity until the Indian government categorized her and other unmarried women, whoever was unmarried, under the caste name called Devadasi. So we did not have the term Devadasi in our own scriptures. The native names of Mahari, Kalavant, Kalavantulu, and Tevaradiyar were forgotten. The families were given the supposedly respectable name of Devadasi by the British government to be made a caste by the Indian government. So the homework was done by the British, but the law being passed was done by the Indian government. To use Amrit Srinivasan's sentence, in parallel to this and complementing this effacement in the garb of reform was revival. So as they were trying to reform this, there was a revival of art forms, dance forms that were coming up. So all the neoclassical dances started coming up at this time. Their art was placed on the respectable upper class bodies that lived in a world of patriarchy. Nataraja, the male dancing god, now became the source of art. Eventually, the art morphed into neoclassical dances to represent the culture of the states of India. The Devadasis watched and continue to watch these new bodies dance from the confines of the now patriarchal families that they live in. She is no longer the head of the family. Men wield power, and they forbid these women from having anything to do with the art. They change their identity in every possible way. When I say they, you can also hear it as we. I am part of them. Manipulating records to change the name of the caste, declaring a respectable geographic space as their native village. For example, I come from the place called Peddapuram. Peddapuram has been at one time so vilified that our families nobody talks about Peddapuram as their native place today. So even in family conversations, when the native place has to be said, we get into a whisper, PDP. We don't even say Peddapuram. It's so hilarious. But it carries a lot of history behind that. They also convert to Christianity or they reject religion. Then they turn to freedom struggle because there was no question of identity. English education, which was very important because we thought English education kind of covers all this completely. hiding the women and even forming a male-dominated artist caste where the women were from the Devadasi families, but they do not dance. So the men, because they knew the art, living with them, knew the art, and they started teaching, while they said, no, we are not the children of the women, the Devadasis. We are an artist group by ourselves. So nobody knows whom they are born to, but they are a different caste by themselves. They also embraced a Brahminic way of life to camouflage their identity. Anything was resorted to. The Devadasi exists, but in unrecognizable forms. I am from the families of the Kalavantulu, from the coastal Andhra region. Kalavantulu is the name given to the hereditary singer-dancer women in the Telugu-speaking areas, popularly known as Devadasis. My maternal grandmother, Chinagandham Kausalya, was born to Kotipalli Madhuravani's son. Madhuravani and her sister Pichayamma Sarojamukhi were patronized by the temple authority of the Annavaram temple. My father, Seshagiri Rao, is the son of a Madhva Brahmin whom my grandmother Suryakantam served all her life. All his life, in fact, because she was about 25 years younger than him. She herself descends from the families that served the Varaha Narasimha Swami temple at Simhachalam near Vishakhapatnam, Andhra Pradesh. So they extracted Gandham. Gandham is the Telugu term for sandal paste for the deity, and so our family name is Chinagandham. Here I am with the complex lineage and blood of the Kalavantulu, the upper caste Zamindar, and the elitist upper caste Brahmin. So who decides what caste is? Who decides what lineage is? Is lineage only connected with blood? Does it not have anything to do with learning lineage from teacher to daughter to the student? Interestingly, coming back to the act itself, the fact that the institution of prostitution and that of the Devadasi were different from each other was conveniently forgotten by the nationalists and the English-educated elites. The temple woman and the backing of the Shastras that she depended on did not stand by her as vehement reforms took over. The Dravidian movement demanded a Dravidian state in 1916 to include all 4 Dravidian-speaking states in South India. In 1925, S. Ramanathan founded the Self-Respect movement. This was propelled by Ramaswamy Nayakar, also called Periyar, by his devotees. The agenda of the movement was anti-Brahmanism. The significant side effect of this movement was the departure of the Devadasi. This group of backward class non-Brahmins fought vehemently for the abolition of the Devadasi Act. This political and legislative cause, as Amrit Srinivasan calls it, was supported by and benefited the men of the community. So, is it caste or is it patriarchy? Because the men within the community worked harder than anybody else to bring this act, to have this law passed. Why? Because it was a matriarchal family and they were the breadwinners, they were the central point in the family. The power was with them. And this, of course, they were told by our elite that it's shameful that a woman has the power. Men became more visible, and the distribution of land, which was not taxable earlier, now became taxable. So once it became taxable, it was open to everybody, and it went to the men now. Once the lands go to the men, the power shifted. Around this time, suddenly, the Devadasi and her like became a caste. Being a part of a caste system gave them a place in the records of the government. They were recognized as citizens of the country, but in the lower rungs. That's a stigma that's carried by the families, even if they are in the best of positions in society. Once the caste angle came in, there was also a scramble to be registered under other castes for respectability. Being a part of a caste brought in bloodlines and genes. So the eclectic nature where the dancers were adopted from different areas, that nature was gone, and then the caste of blood came in. So that only increased stigma. It is easy for society to say people of that caste and so marginalize them. Though the act itself was passed only in 1947, the travails of the women, now prohibited from dancing in the temples, was appalling. Jobless, homeless, and of course with no support, the women had no place to go. Marriage was presented as a solution. This was impossible, what with the stigma on them. Let me explain this. So the act said, now the Devadasis can marry. They don't have to be dedicated, they should not be dedicated to the temples, and now they can marry. I'm almost done. But who will marry them is the question. These women, the Devadasis, who needed domestication in the nationalist agenda, gave up the art and receded from public eye while the men continued to perform. I'll skip this quickly. The practice of adopting girls from kith and kin to teach them the art disappeared. I told you this, men reigned supreme. So was it the British who were responsible for the state of these women, or the Indians with Western values and vested interests? Was it the upper caste elites or the backward class reformists? Was it the priest or the pastor? Wasn't it all of them? While the Devadasi women were efficiently rendered invisible, the art was clung to. It was too rich to be lost. But the Devadasi women were not a saleable resource for rhetoric. So we could not, the nationalists couldn't tell the world that our art, so rich, came from a woman, an unmarried woman. No, that could not be. It doesn't sell. The dance had to be packaged to suit the tastes and agendas of the supporters of Indian nationalism. The Theosophical Society stepped in with its upper caste, Christian biased agendas. Madam H.P. Blavatsky and Colonel H.S. Olcott spearheaded the Theosophical movement and established the headquarters in Adyar in 1882. Rukmini Devi Arundel, a Theosophist herself, played a key role in forming what we have today as Bharatanatyam, which changed content to suit girls from cultured families in her own terms. The Act of 1947, in effect, facilitated the shift of dance from the bodies of professional dancing women to those of the amateur dancers from upper castes. The narrative of the neoclassical dance forms of Kuchipudi, Kathak, and Odissi runs on similar lines. I perform Kuchipudi, a male-specific form from the Telugu-speaking states. I decided to train in dance even as a child. It was not until my teenage that I understood my lineage, as our families never spoke about it due to the appalling stigma attached to it. When I did know about it, I refused to cower in shame. I realized that our silence empowered that section of society that thrived on patriarchy and caste hierarchy to shame us further. Besides, I was and am extremely proud of my lineage. People in power with vested interests may have branded us as fallen women, or even created a situation where some of us were driven to use our bodies for survival or sing bhajans in temples or harikathas. But we know for a fact that we had the courage to live through situations. We know that we, Devadasi women, are the bearers and source for the celebrated dance forms which today trace their lineage to the male god Nataraja and a text, the Natya Shastra. It was our women with their enormous talent who were ready material to sing for the gramophone records and act in Indian cinema when it first came to India, making sure these were there to stay. Their art was used while women from other communities prepared themselves to replace these women to cleanse the film field, to use E. Krishna Iyer's word. I was not to be gaslighted into believing our profession had anything to do other than dance. This stand has never been easy. There were statements like, "You are a Brahmin, you are not even a Brahmin. Why are you so full of God? Why are you vegetarian? You are not a Brahmin." And even more hilarious is, "Your lifestyle is so chaste, you must be a Brahmin. Will you marry my son?" I am a Devadasi, a Kalavantalu woman, fully aware of the wealth of knowledge and socio-political history and presence I embody. I go back to the existing Kalavantalu women while being fully involved with them and learning a repertoire which is not different from their lives. Potema is one of my teachers who lives a life that is not different from the supposedly fictional Seshachalam's life in the story we spoke about earlier. They both exist in the today, not waiting to be recognized for the lives their ancestors did. They are resilience personified. Before I conclude, I briefly refer to the last section of my talk, where I question the disappearance of communities which depended on our families. Weavers, instrument makers, musicians, sculptors, Gudichetivaru or handmaidens, and even Sudigadi Siddhulu, who performed the last rites of our families. They have all receded when the Devadasi system was abolished. Who is responsible for the falling out of this ecosystem? Thank you.
Finger.